Hi everyone, welcome to Startup Arts. Today I'm going to talk about the SWOT analysis. Apologies for how dark this is. It's freezing rain and cold out here, so I'm undercover doing this today. The SWOT analysis is a 4-quadrant chart that covers strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, a lot of investors ask for SWOT analyses, and some advisors as well, and even some large customers if they're thinking about you as more than just a vendor. It's a useful tool to get a 360 view of your business. What does it look like from, what you have, what you don't have so much of, where you're going, and what's standing in your way. Now, I've never particularly liked these things. I had a boss at one time who asked for SWOT analysis for pretty much anything you wanted to do. It used to drive everybody in the team nuts. In fact, one day I poked my head in his office and said, "Hey, 4 of us are going to lunch. Would you like to come along?" And he was like, "I have a meeting right afterwards, 1 o'clock, and I have to hurry, so it's got to be quick." And I said, "Well, we were thinking about going to the taqueria." And he said, "Oh, that's great, because they're really fast and it's pretty close by. But it's in the other direction and it'll be a little hard for me to make it. And plus we'd have to take an extra car anyway because I have to go. But they really have fantastic carne asada there, and I absolutely love carne asada. But, I got this important meeting afterwards, and I don't want anything to disrupt the meeting, you know what I mean?" And as I was walking away, I was like, he just did a SWOT analysis on going to a taqueria for lunch. Anyway, so I had a class at Harvard Business School, and I asked one of the professors there, somebody I respect quite a lot, "So what do you think of a SWOT analysis?" And he said, "Well, like Ronald Reagan said, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist." And it dawned on me, I'm like, that's why I'm always been uncomfortable with these things. They're subjective. And he was like, exactly. They're subjective, and therefore they're useless. Well, I wouldn't go that far. I don't think they're useless. But because they're subjective, they're very hard to craft in a way that will satisfy everyone. For instance, you could put down, I have 3 filed patents. They haven't been issued yet, but they're filed. Someone would say that's a strength because you have intellectual property and something you can count on. Other people would say that was a weakness. They're not filed yet, and they may not get, or they're not granted yet, and they may not get granted, and therefore your intellectual property is shaky. You never know. So there are a couple of ways you can handle this. One is you can create multiple SWOT analysis. So if you have some risk-averse people you have to present this to and some very visionary people you have to present this to, you can create different SWOT analyses that will cover both audiences. And you can think about what the weaknesses in particular and the threats are in those cases so that they'll match your audience more. Now, I don't recommend you do this. There are some people that do recommend you do it, but I don't. And the reason is because it's just a ball of confusion. What you're doing is you're creating multiple messaging. You have to remember who you messaged what to. You have to stay on kind of the message with those people over time. You have to update multiple ones. It just becomes operationally kind of a nightmare and just asking for embarrassment. And to be perfectly honest, when I've seen people do this, they get to the point where they're exaggerating. And the last thing you want to do in a SWOT analysis, or even anywhere with any of this stuff, is exaggerate. So what I recommend you do is do a single SWOT analysis for those investors that ask for it. And you put some effort into actually developing it. And the effort you put into it is putting yourself in the shoes of different perspectives about your SWOT. So if you're the visionary CEO of this company, put yourself in the visionary position, develop the SWOT based on your vision, but also think about the most risk-averse person you know. They're always looking for the problem. They're always looking for the downside. Try and put yourself in their shoes and build the SWOT analysis that way as well. And think about the person who's really operational. Think about the person who's your lawyer, or think about your finance person. So think all the way around your business, which is a useful exercise to do anyway. And then build your SWOT based on the different perspectives that you bring to the table. You're not going to satisfy everyone, but you'll have a better chance of doing it. So let's talk about each of the sections of a SWOT analysis now. We'll go through strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats separately. All right, so strengths. Strengths are typically things that you have in your hand already that you can leverage in order to excel at your business. So these are things like intellectual property, cash on hand if you have some, you've gotten some seed investment or something like that. Some special talent on your team, so some asset that you already have. And it's got to be realistic. We're really smart isn't a strength. I mean, everybody's really smart, right? It has to be something tangible that you have already. The goal of the strength section is basically to answer the question, why you? What's special about you that you can actually do this business? Okay. So weaknesses. Weaknesses are typically operational things, and they're typically operational things that you can solve. I don't have a data scientist on board. Well, that's a solvable problem, right? You may need to get some funding to be able to pay the data scientist or attract somebody, or you may need to go get a network, but eventually you're going to be able to hire a data scientist. Right. So when you think about weaknesses, they're typically operational, and they're typically problems that you can solve. They're not going to be insurmountable, or you're not going to need some extraordinary thing to make them go away. Now, it's really important that for weaknesses, you are incredibly honest about these, because if you miss one and somebody in the room knows about it, it's going to come up, right? So you can't hide from them. And you're going to get asked about these because you're going to have remediation plans. So in your head, when you're presenting this, you shouldn't do it on a slide, but as you're presenting it, you have to say how I'm going to overcome this weakness. What am I going to do to shore up my business in this place? Right. The third thing are opportunities. Now, opportunities typically align really well with the goals of your business. What market do you want to capture? What product do you want to deliver? What kind of customer satisfaction that can you create that is different and more than your competitors, right? So opportunity isn't something like, I'm going to take market share away from these other people. Well, unless you have some really good reason to think why you could do that based on your strengths and the rest of your pitch, frankly, that's not really an opportunity. An opportunity is usually a gap. It's something that's not being served, or it's some value that isn't already being captured. Now, sometimes the opportunity will be taking market share away from somebody else, but everything in that section needs to be backed up with something that is actually consistent with your story. This is essentially answering the question, why now? So what is it about the current situation in the marketplace with the customers, with your product set and your team, that allows you to be able to take advantage of or capture this value now? Then the value is the opportunity. The last section is threats. Now, this one is typically the most difficult one to put together. Now, the reason why it's difficult to put together is because you got to be a little bit vulnerable here, and some of these things can't be overcome very easily, and they're going to cause people who you're presenting to, who are risk averse, to cringe a little bit. Typically don't want to make people cringe, but in this case you're going to have to. Right? So threats are typically things that don't actually exist in the world today, but they could happen and they could have a serious impact on your business. Now, there are a couple of caveats to this, and we'll go over those in a moment, but a good example of a threat is there's a very large company out there that has very deep pockets and is doing business in an adjacent space, and they could come in and develop their own solution to just run us over. Now, there's not a whole lot you can do about that if they choose to do it, and to be perfectly frank, there are going to be people who say, well, that's an opportunity because you could exit by selling to them, right? This is why SWOT analyses are difficult. But those are the kind of things you want to put in your threat section. Now, other kinds of threats can be someone owns some intellectual property, someone has put up a barrier to entry to you, they've locked up a key part of the supply chain or something like that, or they could, right? Not that they haven't already, but they could. And you can go very far afield with the threats section, and I don't recommend you do that. I recommend you pick like the top 5 threats, be perfectly honest about them, and put them on the table. Now, for each one of these things, you should have a mitigation plan as best as possible. So for the big potential competitor out there, you're going to try and come up with some intellectual property. You're going to hire the smartest people. You're going to, whatever you can do to make that as difficult for them to be successful as possible. So remember, threats are unknowns, even when they're things like regulatory threats. So say some new accounting rules or some new EPA rules are going to come out. You're not sure exactly what they are. You might have some idea, but if you don't know, it's a threat. Once they happen and you actually understand how to overcome them, if you can overcome them, they're going to be part of your weakness plan. And also, threats are very size dependent. Whenever you're a very large company, your threats look very different than when you're a very small company. So as a startup, your threats are typically going to be from either large potential competitors, people who aren't competing with you now, or unknowns in the customer base, unknowns in the in your channel, in your supply chain, other places, right? So it's typically going to be unknowns. Okay, so in conclusion, there are 3 things you should take away from this. First is, if you do a SWOT analysis correctly, it shouldn't be very complicated. You should be able to explain every part of the SWOT analysis, every strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat, and where they came from. They should flow naturally from your pitch and even your elevator pitch. And you should have remediation plans and numbers wherever appropriate. So numbers are most appropriate in strengths and weaknesses section. Sometimes in the opportunity section as well, especially if you're talking about the value you can capture. The second thing that's important to remember is that if you do this really well, you can actually use it for a sort of a strategic dashboard. What am I doing, or what are my plans to take advantage of the strengths that I have? What am I doing to shore up the weaknesses of my company? How am I going about capturing the opportunities that I put forward? And what am I doing to mitigate the threats that are on this list? And moreover, if you do this really, really well, you can actually use the SWOT analysis to build a KPI set. And I'll go into that into some different videos and some different articles. But if you do it really well, it can be a very useful tool for you. And lastly, if you do your SWOT analysis correctly, and it's done really well, you can use it to get your team together as well. When everybody knows what the strengths are of the company, what the weaknesses are, what the opportunities are, and what you're going to go after, and what you're really worried about, then you can get your team together and moving in a creative direction to address all of the different items that are on the list. And in fact, you can help them prioritize appropriately, and they can help you as well based on what they're seeing. So a SWOT analysis can be a really useful tool, as long as you make sure you're doing a 360 view of your business from a perspective point of view and not just from the SWOT point of view. Because when you do the perspective point of view, you're going to be able to see your business in many different lights, and that can be nothing but educational for you. So thank you for sitting with me for an analysis of SWOT analysis today. If you have any questions, please contact me and I hope you subscribe. If you're not already a subscriber, I'd love to see you be part of our community. If you think this is useful, please come along for the ride with us. I'll be doing more articles and videos on the more finer grained pieces of the SWOT analysis than I talked about today. But hopefully this gets you started. Again, hope to see you soon. Thank you.